Let's take a look at how we can construct a drop shadow in 2-point perspective. And let's draw something simple like our cube or box. See here. The easiest way to start with understanding how to construct shadows is when we decide that our light source is going to be our sun. The sun is so far away from the Earth that we can simplify the perspective and say that light rays are parallel. This actually allows us to, for example, place the sun right above a vanishing point. So you see my light source is actually up here, this line. And you see that I'm using the vanishing points to construct my cube. So I can also use the height of my sun and the vanishing point on my ground to construct the shadow. And one of the very repetitive elements in shadow construction is going to be your shadow triangle. So what is the shadow triangle? You can start from your light source and draw a ray through, for example, this point here on my cube, because this back edge and those two lines, they're casting a shadow. So through this point along this ground ray till it connects like there. And then from there back, for example, to my vanishing point and up to the sun, you see there's actually a triangle. And that is what I meant here, with the shadow triangle. Let's do this one more time through the other point till it hits the ground ray and there. So to prove or to check if, for example, this line is actually correct, we can extend it to the vanishing point. And if those two lines touch each other along this ray, your shadow is probably correct. One recommendation, try not to have your shadow to get out too far over the cone of vision, because then again your object might look correct, but your shadow might look distorted, something you don't necessarily want. So what you can work with is actually the height of the light. So let's say we have a light here through this point down, and you see that my shadow will be very, very long. Same here. So I get a really long shadow, and I have a tiny object. So this is not really a smart idea, actually. So the best is always to put the light source nice and high, so it's easy to find where it should be. One easy start is actually going to reverse, so go from the ground line through a point and continue up till, for example, you might hit a nice position like here, and then from there I would continue then working, because this is now the light source. I figured out where it has to be based on if this shadow should be that long. So maybe let's continue this way, there, and there. Let's see. Okay, that's somewhat correct. There, and there. That's now our shadow. So just to reinforce it, for example, this is edge 1, shadow edge 1, cube edge 2, shadow edge 2, cube edge 3, shadow edge 3. And even in there, you have those shadow triangles. So this wasn't too difficult. Let's go to a more complicated shape, like this one. Well, actually, it's not complicated. We just have a few more steps. And you can see we have a horizontal edge in the back and a vertical edge. So we know somewhere here and here should be a shadow. So from the sun through this point, and there. Same here, sun to this point, till there. So for example, there I have my two edges. So that wasn't very difficult. But now how do we construct actually the interior space being open and this upper part, which is solid, casting a shadow? Your points of interest is going to be this back edge, because this face below, the light cannot really see. So this front edge and this edge are actually casting a shadow, because this is actually below the object. So below object, the front lines cast shadows. Above an object, the back lines cast a shadow. So from my sun through this point, I just draw a nice long ray. But now the problem is I don't really know where this line actually would touch the ground. So from the vanishing point through this point, and there it is. There. So there I found this line. And I can do the same now with this point till it hits this ray. And then actually I can connect this. Let's check. Yeah, it's somewhat okay. There's my shadow on the ground plane. However, there's one step missing. This object is actually casting a shadow on itself. This front edge here is casting a shadow here. So based on the shadow triangle coming from the sun through this corner point, going down, and in this case here we already have the end point. Here you see there again would be our shadow triangle. So the part that's only visible, for example, would be this line, which I'm drawing a second time. So there it is. This would be the shadow part that is actually casted by the object on itself. Let's go and try out casting a shadow on a shape that is actually bent and not linear. A small tip for construction. You can see that if I create a small box grid, you see I have two proportional squares, and if I create the diagonals inside, you see where the midpoints are of each square. And again, to draw this arc, it starts left there, midpoint, and this is another midpoint on the right. If you would imagine, here would be the other half of the square. And then each arc cuts the diagonal at a 1/3 plus minus position. So you see here I have my midpoint, so this would be 50-50, a little bit to the left. There's the 1/3 position. Okay. Now creating a shadow for a shape like this is not really more difficult. Simply the same steps, working with light shadow triangles. So let's start with the right side. So from our sun through this point, and we can find this vanishing point here. Sorry, not vanishing point, the point where the light ray that casts a shadow would touch the ground plane. Because again, here is my shadow triangle. Okay, so this one, for example, we can keep there. Let's remove this one, and we can do the same from here through this point, and this will be there. There's the other edge. Because again, those two vertical edges are casting those two edges on the ground. But now how do we figure out where this point is here? And this is actually a midpoint. So from here through this point on the ground, I construct a nice long ray. And then from my sun through the upper point, try to find the position where it touches the ground ray. There. Now we have 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Illustrator to construct the arc a little bit more better. I'm going to create myself this line from the other vanishing point because I need it for this, so I can place my 2 points, place this one there, because then I have to push those handles out. And then I could, for example, as well, let's see, maybe create my diagonals and check. Here's the midpoint. Yeah, even this one could go out a little bit more. Same here. So those diagonals I'm sketching in there right now, I need to be there, so in Illustrator I can figure out how to draw the ellipse better, or this arc. But again, in hand drawing, you do the same. So sketch out the box or the plane, square, make your diagonals. So then I understand like where this 1/3 point would be. And here's our shadow. If we compare this arc with this arc, you can see this one looks a little bit more pointy. And that's actually correct, because shadows take the shape and stretch it based on how high the light and how far the light is away from an object. So what does that mean? Let me go actually for a second to a different program. So here we are in Blender, and what you see, we have a ground plane, a cube, and a sunlight. Just for you to understand, if in those programs I move my sunlight up and down, it doesn't really affect the shadow, because in those programs the position of the light here doesn't matter when it's a sun, but the rotation matters. So you see, if I rotate this line, it basically casts the shadow differently. And now if you compare, for example, here's the shadow triangle, there's my sunlight, and if I, for example, say, well, the sunlight is really low on the horizon line, there you see this is a really nice long triangle. The light here casts a longer shadow. If I make this really long, you even see the shadow gets really stretched. And if I maybe make a situation during the day, sunlight is nearly above us, we just have a very small, tiny shadow. So that's the idea of a cube. Let's go maybe to take a look at the arc. So you see there's our arc, and maybe if we say this should be somewhat maybe 2 point. So I try to position the arc maybe the way how we saw it inside the drawing. And you see, if I and there put my light source lower onto the horizon, so closer to the vanishing point, you see also there that this line gets longer. And if you now compare the shape of, for example, this arc and the way how the shadow turns out, you see there are not really the same, and it's getting longer and longer stretched. So that's, for example, the mechanics of how shadow works. One very small tip, in case you have a complicated object or different parts, maybe make a very simple geometrical mock-up, in case you know how to use Blender or, for example, SketchUp or any other 3D program, and just do some very simple shadow studies. This is really very helpful to start understanding how, for example, shadows should look. For example, here I have a cube with a smaller cube added onto it, and there you see that If I add the volume, of course, the shadow will be different. And maybe if I cut this cube out, the shadow has to be subtracted. So you see that there's this empty space because the light source, if I go to here, you can see that's maybe more or less what the light will see. So that's the reason why the shadow is cast that way. And if maybe we go, let's see what we have here. Then we have a sphere. So the shadow of the sphere is kind of like an ellipse when the sphere is actually a circular ball, or you can project or imagine those circles inside. And then there again, based on how far the light is down on the ground plane, the shadow is being stretched. And you see how, for example, here nicely, the shape of this ellipse gets stretched and stretched. And if the light is higher, how it becomes more a circle. And here, for example, we have a cylinder. For the moment, let me rotate it this way. So, for example, you see left and right. This is the shadow part. This is what the light can see, because again, if you go to the light source, it might match up this way. And then I can stretch the light, or I can make the shadow really small. So doing those very simple studies really helps actually to get a good understanding of how shadows should look. So when you apply this then to your drawing, you have a little bit more of understanding how your drawing has to turn out.